Hey everyone, this is Tim Dial and with Nexa Mortgage. And I was just going to put this short video together just to go over a few tips when you are looking to purchase a house and you're just getting started in that process. There's some things that we've been running into lately that I just want to cover on the front end because I think that if people, if borrowers or home purchasers approach this a certain way on the front end, it could help expedite things and get things done in a faster manner, just to make sure that there's no delay in the closing date or something like that. So that's why I wanted to put this together really quickly. I think it's always helpful to share information and what can expedite things, make things go faster. First of all, when you are looking to purchase a house and the lender pulls your credit, from that point forth, normally you don't have to have a second credit report pulled because that credit report's good for 3 months. However, um, you do want to make sure that during that process you don't open new credit. Now, if you have a credit card and you purchase some stuff and put it on that credit card, that's not a big deal because you already had that credit card open. But the big thing is you don't want to open new credit, because if you open new credit, there'll be a new credit inquiry on your credit report. And then just before closing, the underwriter will say, okay, there's this new inquiry. Did this person open new credit? It opens a can of worms that you just don't want to open. And then we have to prove that you didn't open new credit, or if you did, how much is on there, because it could impact your debt ratio. So there's all this stuff. So you're better off just to not open new credit once you have that credit report pulled. And that way there's no issue toward the end of the process, because the underwriter will get notified that you had a new inquiry since the credit report. So they do what's called a credit refresh. It doesn't pull new scores, but it does let them know if there's been any new credit opener or any new inquiries or anything like that. And then we just have to prove, what happened there. So that's the first thing. And especially you don't want to open new credit that does impact your debt ratio, because that could screw everything up. I had a lady once who bought a Winnebago just before the closing, and her debt ratio went through the roof and she couldn't buy the house. So just as one example. But anyway, that's one thing I wanted to cover. The second thing I wanted to cover, which we've been seeing a lot more recently, is sometimes it can delay the closing because we're having difficulty obtaining verifications of employment. Verifications of employment are something that all lenders will require, and they usually will go back at least 2 years to verify employment. Sometimes they go back a little bit further. They have to have 2 years of history according to the guidelines of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA. They all require a 2-year history. So the reason they would go back further than 2 years would be generally because there was some sort of job gap within the previous 2 years, right? So in other words, let's say over the past 2 years, you worked 2 jobs, and one of the jobs you had a 3 or 4 month, between the 2 jobs, you had a 3 or 4 month gap in between them. So if that were to happen, then what they might do is they might need to go back further than 2 years to fill in that 3-month gap to give them a full 2-year history. And then they'll require a letter of explanation or something like that as far as why you were out of work for the 3 months or whatever. If you do have a job gap, they usually want to make sure that your current job, you've been there for at least 6 months. But as long as you've been in the current job for 6 months and we have an explanation as to why there was a job gap, and then there was also some job history prior to the 2 years to fill in that gap, then we're usually okay. But anyway, that's a little bit about what I wanted to cover there. And then as far as the verification of employment, they will require verification of employment for any of the employers during that 2-year period that they're gaining a history of. And the difficulty has been that sometimes employers are just not responsive. So one thing you can do to really help the situation is when you first start the process to purchase a home, and you start, you get with your lender, you get pre-approved, you get a contract on the house, then I would go to your current employer right then and say, look, we're starting the process to purchase a home. We're supposed to be closing in less than a month. The lender will be contacting you to get a verification of employment, and I'd like to expedite that as quickly as possible to make sure that the closing isn't delayed. So you can find out their process for getting the verification of employment. Sometimes they have an automated system or something like that, or sometimes they have a particular HR person that does that manually. You just don't know what the process is. It will certainly expedite things if you find that out on the front end from your employer. Then the second thing is if there's a previous employer, sometimes previous employers are the most difficult because you don't work there anymore. So sometimes they can be really difficult. But if you know somebody at the previous employer that can help you with that process, contact them and say, hey, look, I'm in the process of buying a house. My lender's going to need a verification of employment. Is there somebody that you can get me in touch with that will help expedite that process when we get started? And then we can get that information to the loan processor, and they can get that stuff back more quickly, most likely, and make sure that the process isn't delayed because of verification of employment. That's usually, when we're seeing delays in the closing date, a lot of times it's because of the verifications, because it took 2 weeks to get a verification of employment back or something like that, because the previous employer or something wasn't being responsive and it was a huge headache. And they finally got it back, but we had to badger them to finally get it back. So if there's anything you can do on the front end, it would certainly make a big impact just to make sure that that doesn't delay things. Something else that can delay things is during the appraisal process. Usually with conventional loans, it's not as much of an issue, but during the appraisal process for a government loan like FHA, VA, or USDA, they will do a checklist inspection. And during that checklist inspection, they may come up with things that they want to have repaired prior to the closing. And so then what happens is they'll get the appraisal back. It'll say what the repairs need to be. And then the seller has to go out and make those repairs before you can close. And then the appraiser has to go back to the house to re-inspect it to make sure that they were actually done. And so one of the other things that could potentially expedite things is that if you're going into a house, look for things that could be safety concerns, like if there are stairs and there's no rail to hold on to when you're walking up the stairs, or a back patio or porch that's raised and there's no rail to keep people from falling off, or things like that. They look for safety concerns. They also look for things like chipped paint around and usually it's on the outside of the house. But the reason I don't like chipped paint is because it can be lead-based. And especially if it's an older home, and lead-based paint can be poisonous if kids put it in their mouth or something like that. So that's a safety concern. A lot of times they'll require any kind of chipped paint or paint that's chipping off in certain areas. They'll require that to be sanded and repainted. So some of these issues you can kind of deal with on the front end. If you see them when you go into the house, you can actually write into the contract for certain things to be fixed. And that way they know to go ahead and repair them on the front end before the appraiser comes out. That's also going to save you some money because the appraiser charges the borrower to come back out to the house to reinspect. It's usually $150 to $200. So you pay $600 for an appraisal or $650 for an appraisal or something like that, and then the appraiser has to go back out. You're going to pay an extra $150 to $200 just because those repairs had to be made and they had to reinspect. So if you can get that stuff done before the appraisal, before the appraiser gets out there, sometimes you can avoid that whole issue, and then you don't have a delay in the closing because of that reinspection needing to be done. So anyway, those are some of the things I wanted to cover really quickly. And if you have any questions or anything, or you need to talk to me, feel free at any point. My number's up here, and my email address is tdial@nexamortgage.com. And I look forward to talking to you in the future. Thanks.